Lawrenceville, Georgia in the summer of 2018 was a quiet slice of suburban life. The lawns were neatly trimmed, families waved at one another, and the hum of routine kept the neighborhood in a comforting rhythm. It was the kind of place where people noticed if a car sat parked too long in the driveway or if the mail wasn't picked up for a day. Nobody expected a storm brewing behind closed doors. Harold McAllister was a handyman by trade, known for his precision and quiet demeanor. He wasn't the type to strike up a conversation, but if your gutter was clogged or your porch needed fixing, Harold was the man to call. His wife, Denise, was the opposite, bubbly, approachable, and seemingly always on the go. A nurse at the local clinic, she was a familiar face to many, often stopping to chat at the grocery store or after church services. Together, they painted the picture of a hardworking couple, but anyone who looked closely would see the cracks in their facade. Denise's laugh, once so frequent, had become more subdued. She avoided questions about Harold, redirecting conversations with practiced ease. Coworkers noticed how her phone always seemed to vibrate during lunch breaks, her face tightening with every message. "He just likes to check in," she would say with a thin smile when asked. But behind that smile, Denise was growing weary. Harold's meticulous nature had shifted over the years into something darker. He began cataloging Denise's movements, memorizing her work schedule, and questioning her every outing. He didn't yell or lose his temper. Instead, his control was quiet, calculated, suffocating. Denise felt the walls closing in, but she wasn't ready to admit it. Not yet. Their neighbors, too, sensed something amiss. "We used to see her gardening all the time," Mrs. Watson across the street remarked to her husband one evening. "But now it's just Harold out there. She hasn't been herself lately." The Watsons didn't pry. People in Lawrenceville valued their privacy. Still, unease rippled through the cul-de-sac like a faint, unspoken whisper. Denise, ever the optimist, tried to maintain a sense of normalcy. She focused on her patients, her friendships, and finding moments of peace where she could. But even those small escapes were monitored. Harold made sure of that. Her co-worker, Maria, noticed how Denise flinched at loud noises or sudden movements. "Are you okay?" Maria asked one afternoon, her voice low and careful. Denise hesitated. "I'm fine," she said too quickly. But her eyes, darting to the clock, betrayed her. She was anything but fine. As days turned into weeks, Denise began quietly planning her escape. She started keeping cash in an old shoebox under the bed and researched divorce attorneys during her lunch breaks. She avoided leaving traces, clearing her browser history and using her work computer. "You have to be smart about this," she told herself, her heart pounding every time she closed a tab. What Denise didn't know was that Harold was already suspicious. He had started checking her phone when she was in the shower and reading her emails. One night, he sat in their living room, staring at her laptop screen with clenched fists. What he saw confirmed his worst fears. Denise wasn't just pulling away, she was planning to leave him. The next morning, Harold was unusually quiet. Denise chalked it up to a bad mood, unaware that her careful plans were unraveling before they could even begin. But Harold's silence wasn't anger, it was calculation. And as Denise walked out the door to work that day, smiling at a neighbor as if everything were normal, Harold watched her go, his expression unreadable. The air in the McAllister house grew heavier with each passing day, an invisible tension that settled into every corner. Denise continued her routine, unaware of the storm about to break. Harold, always meticulous, was preparing for what he saw as his only option. The neighborhood remained quiet, oblivious to the darkness creeping beneath its serene surface. Denise stood in the break room at the clinic, staring at her phone screen. Her heart raced as she read the email again. "Appointment confirmed for next Tuesday at 2 p.m. Thank you for choosing our legal team." She quickly deleted it, slipping the phone back into her pocket. Every precaution mattered now. Every move she made had to be calculated, precise, unseen. Maria entered the room, catching Denise's distracted expression. "Everything okay?" Maria asked softly, her brow furrowed. Denise forced a smile, brushing her hair back. "Yeah, just tired," she lied. But Maria knew her friend too well. There was something deeper at play, though Denise wasn't ready to share it. Not yet. That evening, Harold was already sitting in his usual chair when Denise walked through the door. The TV flickered in the dimly lit living room, casting long shadows on the walls. Harold's eyes flicked up briefly before settling back on the screen. "You're late," he said, his tone calm, but with an edge that Denise had learned to navigate. "Traffic," she replied, hanging her bag on the hook by the door. Dinner was silent except for the occasional clink of silverware on plates. Harold seemed distant, his gaze fixed somewhere beyond Denise. She felt the tension in the room tighten with every second. "How was work?" she ventured cautiously. "Fine," Harold muttered, not meeting her eyes. He didn't ask her the same question, and Denise didn't press further. Later that night, as Denise stood in front of the bathroom mirror brushing her teeth, her phone buzzed on the counter. She glanced at the screen, just a calendar reminder for tomorrow's schedule, but Harold's shadow appeared in the doorway before she could lock the screen. "Who's texting you at this hour?" he asked, his voice unnervingly steady. "Just a reminder for work," she said, holding her breath. Harold lingered for a moment before retreating down the hall, but Denise felt the familiar knot of fear tighten in her chest. He was watching more closely now. She needed to be even more careful. The next morning, as Denise prepared for work, Harold's demeanor shifted. He was uncharacteristically helpful, making coffee and even offering to warm up her car. Denise hesitated, unsure whether to trust this sudden change, but she accepted the coffee with a quiet "thank you." As she walked to the car, she caught a glimpse of Harold standing in the window, watching her leave. At the clinic, Denise logged onto her computer and opened the browser to check her email. She typed quickly, her eyes darting to the doorway every few seconds. She'd confirmed her legal consultation, but the risk weighed heavily on her. If Harold found out, she wasn't sure what he would do. "It's just one more week," she whispered to herself, her fingers trembling on the keyboard. Just one more week. Meanwhile, Harold sat in the living room, his hands clasped tightly as he stared at Denise's laptop. She had forgotten to log out of her account before leaving for work. The email was there, plain as day, a confirmation from the divorce attorney. His face twisted into a mask of disbelief and fury. He scrolled through her history, piecing together her plans. She'd been saving money. She'd been making moves behind his back. When Denise returned home that evening, Harold greeted her with a forced calm. "Long day?" he asked, his tone unreadable. Denise nodded, her guard instinctively rising. As the night stretched on, Harold said little, his silence more unsettling than his words. Denise tried to act normal, but the tension in the house was palpable. She could feel Harold's eyes on her, unblinking, piercing. The following night, after Denise had gone to bed, Harold paced the living room. His thoughts raced as he played the situation over and over in his mind. Denise wasn't just drifting away. She was planning to leave him entirely. And Harold wasn't about to let that happen. He opened the door to the crawl space, his breath heavy in the quiet. The dim light from the hallway revealed the cold, empty space beneath the house. His jaw clenched. If she wanted to leave so badly, maybe he needed to take control before she could. The first thing Denise felt was the cold. It wrapped around her body like a damp, suffocating shroud. Her head throbbed as she opened her eyes, but the darkness was absolute. She tried to move, only to realize her arms were pinned awkwardly beneath her. The surface beneath her was hard, uneven, and cold to the touch. Concrete, she thought. Her breathing quickened as panic set in. "Harold?" she called out weakly, her voice trembling. There was no response. She pushed against the floor, trying to sit up, but her body screamed in protest. She wasn't sure how long she'd been unconscious or even where she was. The last thing she remembered was Harold standing over her, his face a mask of cold determination. A faint creak above her made her heart race. Denise held her breath, straining to listen. Footsteps, slow, deliberate. Her pulse thundered in her ears as she tried to make sense of the situation. Then she heard his voice, muffled but unmistakable, coming from somewhere above. "You'll thank me for this someday," Harold said. His tone was disturbingly calm, almost conversational. "I had to do it. You were going to ruin everything." Denise's mind reeled. She tried to scream, but her voice came out hoarse, barely audible. She clawed at the walls around her, the tips of her fingers scraping against rough wooden beams and cold concrete. It didn't take long for her to realize where she was, beneath their house, the crawl space. Desperation surged through her veins as she began pounding on the underside of the floorboards above her. "Harold, let me out!" she cried, her voice breaking. But the only response was silence. He wasn't listening, or worse, he didn't care. Hours passed, or maybe it was minutes. Time had become meaningless in the pitch black. Denise's body shivered uncontrollably, her teeth chattering as the damp air sapped her strength. She tried to focus on her breathing, forcing herself to stay calm. Panicking would only make things worse. She had to think. Reaching out, her fingers brushed against something sharp, a nail. Her hands trembled as she grasped it, her mind racing with possibilities. Slowly, she began scratching at a piece of plywood lying nearby, carving out letters with painstaking effort. H-E-L-P. Each stroke felt like an eternity, but it gave her something to cling to: hope. Above her, Harold moved through the house as if nothing had happened. The faint sound of the television filtered down through the floorboards, a stark reminder of how ordinary the world above seemed compared to the nightmare Denise was enduring below. Harold returned hours later, his footsteps heavier now. The hatch to the crawlspace creaked open, and a dim sliver of light pierced the darkness. Denise shielded her eyes, her heart pounding as Harold crouched down, peering at her with an unsettling calm. "You'll stay down here until you come to your senses," he said, his voice devoid of any empathy. He placed a small plate of food and a bottle of water just out of reach. "Eat. You'll need your strength." Denise's anger flared. "You can't keep me here, Harold. People will notice I'm gone," she shouted, her voice raw with desperation. Harold didn't flinch. Instead, he closed the hatch without another word, leaving her once again in the suffocating darkness. Denise's mind raced. She thought of Maria, who would surely notice her absence. She thought of her co-workers, the neighbors, anyone who might suspect something was wrong. But the longer she sat in the silence, the more the fear crept in. What if no one came? What if Harold had planned this so carefully that he would get away with it? Her hands found the nail again and she resumed scratching. It was slow, grueling work, but she refused to stop. "Help, Denise, under house!" The words became her mantra, her lifeline. She didn't know if anyone would ever see them, but it was all she had. All she could do was wait and hope. Maria stared at her phone, her brow furrowed, as the unanswered calls to Denise's number added to her growing unease. "Hey, it's Denise. Leave a message," the familiar voicemail said, for the third time that day. Maria hung up, her fingers tightening around the phone. Something wasn't right. Denise never missed work without calling ahead. Never. That afternoon at the clinic, Denise's absence became the primary topic of concern among the staff. "Has anyone heard from her?" one nurse asked. "She's never late, let alone a no-show." The supervisor, clearly irritated, muttered something about calling Denise's emergency contact, but Maria knew that wasn't enough. She could feel it deep in her gut. This wasn't like Denise. By evening, Maria's worry had grown into outright fear. She called the Lawrenceville Police Department, her voice shaking as she explained. "My friend hasn't been to work, and no one's heard from her. This isn't like her." The officer on the other end asked routine questions, but Maria could sense the skepticism in his tone. Missing adult cases often started this way, most resolved within a day or two, when the person turned up unharmed. But Maria insisted, "You don't understand, something's wrong." Meanwhile, Harold paced his living room, his mind racing. He had anticipated Denise's co-workers calling, perhaps even the police, but he was prepared. When the knock on the door came, Harold opened it with practiced calm, greeting the officer with a polite smile. "We've received a report that your wife, Denise McAllister, hasn't been seen or heard from," the officer said, his tone neutral but probing. "Do you know where she might be?" "She left," Harold said smoothly, leaning against the doorframe. "We had a fight a few days ago. She said she needed space. I think she mentioned Florida." His words were measured, delivered with just enough conviction to sound plausible. But the officer's gaze lingered, as if searching for cracks in the story. "Did she take her car?" the officer asked, jotting notes into a small notepad. Harold hesitated, then shook his head. "No, she said she'd arranged something else. Maybe a friend drove her. She didn't exactly leave me a detailed itinerary." The officer nodded, but something about Harold's composure felt off. "Would you mind if we looked around?" he asked. Harold's smile faltered just for a second before he stepped aside. "Be my guest," he said. The police searched the house quickly, their movements efficient but cursory. They checked the bedrooms, the kitchen, even the backyard. But the crawl space, a shadowed, padlocked corner near the back of the house, went unnoticed. Harold stood by, his hands in his pockets, his face a mask of calm. When the officer returned to the front door, he closed his notepad with a faint sigh. "If you hear from her, please call us." "Of course," Harold said, his tone almost too agreeable. As the police car pulled away, Harold exhaled, his shoulders dropping slightly. The first hurdle was over, but he knew this was only the beginning. They'd be back. He was sure of it. The next morning, Maria called again. "Anything?" she asked the officer she'd spoken to the day before. "Nothing definitive yet," he replied. "But if you think of anything, any detail at all that might help, let us know." Maria thought hard. Then she remembered something, a conversation from weeks ago. Denise, laughing nervously, had said, "If I ever go missing, start by asking Harold." At the time, it had seemed like a joke, a dark, throwaway comment during a stressful shift. But now it played on repeat in Maria's mind, its weight undeniable. By the end of the day, the police decided to follow up. Denise's car was still parked outside her home, its windows fogged from days of disuse. The officer who'd spoken to Harold felt a tug of doubt. Something about the man's demeanor didn't sit right. With a warrant request already in motion, the case was slowly shifting. Inside the house, Harold sat in his chair, staring at the floor. Beneath his feet, Denise scratched another letter into the wood, H-E-L-P. The sound was faint, nearly imperceptible, but to Harold it was deafening. Denise's fingers were raw, her nails chipped and bleeding as she pressed the rusted nail into the plywood for the 100th time. H-E-L-P. The letters had taken shape slowly, each stroke a desperate attempt to break through the suffocating silence that surrounded her. She didn't know if anyone would ever see the message, but it was all she had, all she could cling to. Above her, the faint creak of Harold's footsteps echoed through the floorboards. She froze, her breath caught in her throat. The light from the small vented panel at the far end of the crawlspace barely illuminated her surroundings, but it was enough to cast eerie shadows that danced with every movement. She hated that light. It was a cruel reminder of the world she couldn't reach. The hatch to the crawlspace creaked open, and Harold's voice followed, calm and deliberate. "You need to understand," he said, lowering a plate of food and a small bottle of water into the darkness. "I'm doing this for us. You forced my hand." His tone sent chills down Denise's spine. He spoke as though he truly believed his actions were justified, as though he wasn't the monster she now saw him as. "Let me out," Denise croaked, her voice hoarse from days of shouting into the void. "This isn't love, Harold. This is madness." He didn't answer. The hatch slammed shut, plunging her back into suffocating darkness. Denise's tears fell silently as she stared at the scratched letters on the plywood, her resolve hardening. Someone would find her. They had to. Outside, the investigation was gaining momentum. Maria's persistence had finally pushed the police to act, and a warrant to search the McAllister home was in progress. One officer, however, wasn't waiting. Detective Larkin had seen too many cases like this. Domestic disputes that spiraled into something far darker. Something about Harold's calm demeanor didn't sit right with him. Returning to the neighborhood unannounced, Larkin knocked on the door of the Watsons, Harold and Denise's neighbors. "Have you noticed anything strange lately?" he asked. Mrs. Watson hesitated. "Well, Harold's been quieter than usual, and the other day I saw a piece of plywood leaning against his shed. It had scratches on it, like letters." "Letters?" Larkin pressed, his pulse quickening. "Did you see what it said?" "I didn't get a good look," she admitted, "but it seemed strange, and Harold looked nervous when I mentioned it." Larkin's instincts flared. Back at the station, he pushed for the search warrant to be expedited, arguing that every moment mattered. "Something's off with this guy," he said to his colleagues. "I can feel it." Meanwhile, Harold's paranoia was growing. He noticed the extra patrol car parked on the corner of the street, the occasional glances from neighbors. He started pacing at night, muttering under his breath. His trips to the crawlspace became less frequent, his interactions with Denise more strained. She saw the cracks in his composure, the way his hand trembled when he set down her food. It gave her hope. He was losing control. As the police closed in, Denise continued to scratch the message into the wood, carving deeper, bolder strokes. "Help, Denise, under house." Her hands ached, her body screamed for rest, but she refused to stop. If someone, anyone, found her message, it might be enough. It had to be. And then, late one night, Denise heard it. A sound she hadn't heard in what felt like forever. The faint rumble of voices above her. Not Harold's voice. Others. Her heart pounded as she pressed herself against the wooden beams, straining to catch a word, a hint of what was happening. Could it be the police? She dared to hope. Detective Larkin stood at the edge of the McAllister property, his eyes scanning the darkened house. The search warrant had finally come through, and the team was ready to move in. He glanced at the officers beside him, their expressions tense but focused. "Let's do this," he said, motioning them forward. The knock on Harold's door was firm, authoritative. Harold opened it slowly, his face a practiced mask of calm. "Evening, officers. What can I do for you?" "We have a warrant to search your property," Larkin said, holding up the document. Harold's jaw tightened, but he stepped aside, his movements stiff and deliberate. "Go ahead," he said, his voice flat. The officers spread out, their flashlights cutting through the dim interior of the house. Larkin's attention lingered on Harold, who had taken a seat in the living room, his hands folded tightly in his lap. The man was composed, but there was a nervous energy in the way his foot tapped against the floor. Larkin's instincts screamed that they were close to something big. In the kitchen, one of the officers noticed scratches on the floorboards near the corner of the room. He crouched down, running his fingers along the grooves. "Detective," he called out. Larkin was there in seconds. "What is it?" "Looks like someone's been moving something heavy over this spot," the officer replied, pointing to faint drag marks that led to a small, locked hatch. Larkin's stomach tightened as he motioned for a crowbar. "Get it open." Harold, still seated, clenched his fists. "There's nothing down there. Just old tools and junk," he said, his voice carrying a hint of panic. Larkin didn't respond. The officer pried the hatch open, revealing a dark, narrow crawl space. The stench of damp earth and mildew wafted out, making the team recoil slightly. "Flashlights," Larkin said, crouching at the edge of the opening. The beam of light cut through the shadows, illuminating the crawl space. At first, all they saw was debris, planks of wood, forgotten tools, and loose insulation. Then they saw her. Denise lay curled against the far wall, her body frail, her clothes filthy and torn. The words scratched into the plywood beside her were unmistakable. "Help. Denise. Under house." For a moment, the officers froze, the weight of the discovery settling over them like a heavy fog. "Ma'am," Larkin called out, his voice steady but urgent. Denise stirred, her movement sluggish. Her face turned toward the light, her eyes blinking against the sudden brightness. "Please, help me," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Get her out of there," Larkin barked. The team sprang into action, carefully pulling Denise from the crawl space. She winced as they lifted her, her body weak but alive. Harold bolted from his chair, but an officer intercepted him, pinning him to the ground. "You don't understand," Harold shouted, his voice breaking. "She needed to stay. She was going to ruin everything." Larkin ignored him, his attention focused solely on Denise. "You're safe now," he said softly as they placed her on a stretcher. Her lips quivered, tears streaming down her face as she clung to the officer's hand. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I thought no one would come." Outside, the quiet neighborhood came alive with flashing lights and murmured voices as neighbors gathered to watch. Mrs. Watson stood at the edge of her driveway, her hands covering her mouth in shock. "I knew something was wrong," she whispered to her husband, her voice shaking. As Harold was dragged away in handcuffs, his shouts echoed down the street. "I saved her! I saved our marriage!" he screamed, his voice raw with desperation. Larkin turned to the officers. "Make sure he doesn't get within a mile of her again," he said coldly. The ambulance doors closed and Denise was whisked away to safety. Larkin stood in the driveway, staring at the house that had hidden so much darkness. The plywood with Denise's message was carefully bagged as evidence, a haunting reminder of her resilience. He exhaled slowly, the adrenaline fading, leaving behind only the weight of what they had uncovered. Detective Larkin sat at his desk, sifting through the growing pile of evidence collected from the McAllister home. Photographs of the crawl space, Harold's erratic notebooks, and a log of Denise's daily movements painted a chilling picture. Each new detail seemed to pull them deeper into the mind of a man unraveling under the weight of his obsession. The notebooks were the most disturbing. Meticulously detailed entries revealed Harold's descent into paranoia. He had recorded everything: the time Denise left for work, who she spoke to, even the contents of her grocery bags. One line, written in shaky handwriting, caught Larkin's eye. "She's slipping away, but I won't let her. She needs to remember what we had." It was equal parts love letter and warning. The surveillance footage taken from a hidden camera in the living room was equally damning. Grainy clips showed Denise sitting alone, visibly tense, while Harold's shadow loomed just out of frame. In one clip, Harold appeared to adjust the angle of the camera, his face a mask of determination. It was clear this was no impulsive act. Harold had been planning for months. At the station, Harold sat in the interrogation room, his hands cuffed to the table. He stared at the wall, his expression blank. When Larkin entered, Harold didn't even flinch. "You've been busy," Larkin said, dropping the notebook onto the table. "Spying on your wife, tracking her every move, locking her under your house. What were you thinking?" Harold's lips twitched into a faint smile. "You don't understand," he said, his voice low and even. She was going to destroy everything. I saved her. Larkin leaned forward, his voice sharp. Saved her? You call locking her in a crawl space saving her? She was starving, Harold, terrified. She could have died down there. Harold's composure cracked, his voice rising. She didn't love me anymore. She was going to leave. I had to make her see. I had to remind her of what we had. His words spilled out in a chaotic rush, a twisted justification that only deepened the horror of what he had done. Larkin pushed a photograph across the table, a close-up of the words Denise had scratched into the plywood. Help. Denise. Under house. Harold's eyes flicked to the photo, and for a moment he looked almost remorseful. But the moment passed and he leaned back, a trace of defiance returning to his gaze. She'll understand one day, he muttered. She'll thank me. Meanwhile, Denise was recovering in the hospital, her frail body slowly regaining strength. The nurses marveled at her resilience. Despite everything she had endured, she spoke with clarity, recounting the harrowing details of her captivity to investigators. He wasn't always like this, she said softly, her voice tinged with sadness. There was a time when he was kind, but something changed, and I didn't see it until it was too late. The community, too, was grappling with the fallout. Neighbors who had once admired Harold's work ethic and quiet demeanor now questioned how they had missed the signs. I saw him tinkering around the crawl space a few weeks ago, one neighbor confessed. I thought he was fixing something. I never imagined. As the investigation continued, more pieces of Harold's plan came to light. Emails recovered from his computer showed he had been researching locks, soundproofing materials, and ways to reinforce the crawl space. It wasn't just an impulsive act, it was a calculated attempt to control Denise completely. Larkin stared at the mountain of evidence on his desk, a knot tightening in his stomach. Despite Harold's calm demeanor, his actions revealed a deeply fractured psyche. And while Denise had been rescued, the scars of Harold's obsession would linger far longer than the physical wounds. For Harold, the walls were closing in. But for Denise, the nightmare was finally over, or so she hoped. The courtroom buzzed with subdued murmurs as the bailiff announced, "All rise." Harold McAllister entered, his shackled hands drawing audible gasps from the packed gallery. Denise sat quietly near the front, her face pale but resolute, flanked by her attorney and a victim's advocate. The air was heavy with tension, every eye in the room trained on Harold as he shuffled to his seat. The prosecutor, Rachel Daniels, began her opening statement with a grim cadence. This is not a case of a misunderstanding or a moment of poor judgment. This is a case of calculated control, of obsession turned into imprisonment, and of a victim who fought against all odds to survive. She gestured to Denise, her voice rising with conviction. This is about justice for her. Harold's defense attorney, James Creighton, painted a different picture. Harold McAllister is a man overwhelmed, a man who acted out of fear of losing the life he built with his wife. His actions, while misguided, were not malicious. He needs help, not condemnation. The argument felt hollow in the charged atmosphere, but Harold sat unmoving, his face unreadable. Denise took the stand the next day. The room fell silent as she recounted her harrowing experience, her voice steady but tinged with emotion. I woke up in complete darkness, she began, her hands trembling slightly. I didn't know where I was. I could hear him above me, walking, talking to himself. I screamed, I begged, but he wouldn't answer. He just left me there. Her testimony painted a vivid picture of her captivity. The hunger, the cold, the isolation. I thought I was going to die under that house, she said, her voice breaking. The only thing that kept me going was the thought that someone would notice I was missing, that someone would come looking for me. When the prosecutor held up a photo of the plywood with the words, "Help, Denise." Under house scratched into it, the courtroom collectively exhaled, a wave of unease rippling through the gallery. Denise looked at the image, her eyes welling with tears. I wrote that, she said softly. I didn't think anyone would ever see it. The defense attempted to counter, questioning Denise's recollection and implying that Harold's actions were driven by mental instability rather than malice. Did Harold ever physically harm you during your time in the crawl space? Creighton asked. Denise stiffened but answered clearly, no, but he didn't have to, the fear was enough. Harold's own testimony was a spectacle of denial and warped reasoning. I wasn't trying to hurt her, he said, his voice low. I was trying to save her. She was making bad decisions. Leaving me would have been the biggest mistake of her life, the prosecutor pounced. So you thought locking your wife under your house, starving her, isolating her was saving her? Do you even understand what you've done to her? Harold faltered, his gaze dropping to the table. I didn't mean for it to go that far, he mumbled. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours. When they returned, the verdict was clear. Guilty on all counts, including kidnapping, false imprisonment, and attempted murder. The judge's voice was firm as he handed down the sentence. Life in prison, without the possibility of parole. As Harold was escorted out, his expression remained impassive. Denise watched him go, a mix of relief and sadness in her eyes. The weight of what had happened would stay with her forever, but she had survived, and now she could begin to heal. Outside the courthouse, reporters clamored for statements. Denise's attorney spoke on her behalf. This case serves as a reminder of the dangers of unchecked control and the strength of those who fight to survive. Denise, standing quietly beside him, held her head high, her silence speaking volumes. As the crowd dispersed, Detective Larkin approached Denise, his expression warm but serious. "You're stronger than most people I've met," he said. Denise smiled faintly, her voice steady. "I didn't have a choice, but I'm grateful someone listened." The nightmare was over. Justice had been served. But for Denise, the journey of reclaiming her life was only beginning. The Watsons stood at their kitchen window, staring out at the McAllister house. The once modest and quiet home now carried a haunting weight, its walls steeped in a darkness no one had suspected. "I should have known," Mrs. Watson whispered, her voice trembling. Her husband placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder, but she pulled away. "No, really. I heard the shouting that night, but I didn't do anything." Across the street, neighbors gathered in hushed groups, their conversations tinged with guilt and disbelief. "Did you hear what they found in his house? A crawl space? She was trapped down there the whole time," one man said, shaking his head. "And to think Harold used to help me fix my gutters," another added, his tone disbelieving. In the days following the trial, Lawrenceville found itself grappling with difficult questions. How had such a monstrous act gone unnoticed for so long? Could anyone have stopped it before it reached such horrific depths? The answers were as uncomfortable as the questions themselves. Detective Larkin, now somewhat of a reluctant local figure, was approached constantly as he went about his day. "Do you think we could have done more?" a woman asked him at the coffee shop. Larkin sighed, his usual steady demeanor softening. "It's hard to say. People like Harold don't show their true colors until it's too late. But yes, I believe communities can do more." The case also sparked broader discussions within the local police department. A review of domestic disturbance reports revealed gaps in follow-up procedures. Officers were instructed to take even seemingly minor complaints seriously, recognizing that they could be signs of something far more sinister. For Denise, the community's guilt was a double-edged sword. On one hand, their support was a lifeline during her recovery. Neighbors dropped off meals, donated to her medical bills, and helped her move into a new apartment, far from the house she'd once called home. On the other hand, their sorrow often felt misplaced. "You couldn't have known," she told Mrs. Watson during one visit. But the older woman shook her head, tears welling up in her eyes. "I should have asked. I should have knocked on the door." Denise's voice grew stronger each time she told her story. First to investigators, then to reporters, and finally at community meetings. She spoke about the importance of noticing red flags, unexplained absences, sudden personality changes, signs of isolation. "I ignored them myself for too long," she admitted during one gathering at a local church. "But now I see that we all have a responsibility. If you think something is wrong, say something. It could save a life." The media attention brought waves of both discomfort and action to Lawrenceville. Some felt exposed, fearing judgment for not stepping in sooner. Others felt empowered to do better. Local organizations hosted workshops on recognizing domestic abuse, and Denise partnered with one to launch a campaign called Signs We Missed. Flyers appeared in grocery stores, gas stations, and community centers, detailing the subtle indicators of coercive control and offering resources for victims. Even as progress was made, the weight of Harold's actions lingered like a shadow over the community. His house was eventually sold, but rumors swirled about its new occupants. Some neighbors avoided the street altogether, unwilling to walk past the reminder of their shared failure. Others, like Maria, visited Denise regularly, determined to show her that she wasn't alone. One evening, as Denise and Maria sat together on Denise's small balcony, Maria hesitated before speaking. Do you think he ever really loved you?" The question hung in the air, heavy and unavoidable. Denise looked out at the fading sunset, her expression unreadable. "Maybe he did," she said quietly, "but not in the way that matters. Love isn't supposed to hurt like that." The quiet reflection of Denise's words echoed in the hearts of everyone who heard her speak. For Lawrenceville, the scars of Harold's crimes would never fully heal. But in the wake of darkness, a new resolve emerged. To be better, to notice more, to act when action was needed. And for Denise, that was enough. The morning sun spilled through the windows of Denise's new apartment, casting a warm glow over the simple space. It wasn't much, just a small one-bedroom place with a view of a quiet park. But to Denise, it was everything. It was hers. No locks she hadn't placed herself. No shadows lurking just out of sight. Just peace. She sipped her coffee, the mug warm in her hands as she watched the trees sway gently in the breeze. It had been 6 months since Harold's trial, but some days it felt like it had been a lifetime ago. Other days, the memories were so vivid that she swore she could still feel the cold concrete of the crawl space beneath her fingertips. Her phone buzzed on the table, pulling her back to the present. It was Maria. "Hey," Denise said, her voice soft but cheerful. "Hey," Maria replied. "Just checking in. How are you doing?" "I'm okay," Denise said, glancing out the window again. "Better, I think." Maria hesitated, then said, "You're stronger than you give yourself credit for, you know that?" Denise smiled faintly. "I don't feel strong most days, but I'm trying." After the call, Denise grabbed her notebook from the counter and flipped to a blank page. She had started journaling as part of her therapy, a way to process the chaos and find meaning in what she'd endured. At first, the words had been messy, fragmented. Now they were deliberate, filled with hope as much as pain. Later that afternoon, Denise drove to the community center where she had begun volunteering with a local domestic abuse organization. The work was challenging but deeply fulfilling. She shared her story sparingly, only when she felt it would help someone see that they weren't alone. Most of the time, she listened. That day, she met a young woman named Lily, whose hesitant words mirrored Denise's own from years ago. I don't know if it's bad enough to leave," Lily said, her voice barely above a whisper. Denise leaned forward, her gaze steady. "It's bad enough if you feel like this. You deserve better. You deserve to feel safe." Lily's eyes filled with tears, and Denise handed her a tissue. "You're not alone," she said gently. "And there are people who can help." As Denise drove home that evening, she felt a flicker of something she hadn't felt in a long time: purpose. Harold had tried to take everything from her, her freedom, her strength, even her voice, but he had failed. She had survived. And now, she was determined to turn her pain into something meaningful. Back in her apartment, Denise sat on the couch, flipping through the Signs We Missed flyer she had helped design. It was simple but effective, listing the red flags of abuse and the resources available to those in need. She thought about all the people who might see it, the ones too afraid to speak up, too unsure to leave. If even one person found the courage to escape because of it, it would be worth everything. As the evening faded into night, Denise lit a candle on the windowsill, a small ritual she'd started to honor her progress. Each flame, she decided, represented a step forward, a reminder that even in the darkest moments, light was possible. She thought about Harold less often now. When she did, it wasn't with anger or fear, but with clarity. He had been broken in ways she couldn't fix, and she had paid the price for his pain. But she refused to let him define her. She was more than what he had tried to make her. She was free. Denise picked up her pen and wrote the final line in her journal for the day. "Today I lived for myself." She closed the book, placed it on the table, and took a deep breath. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, but for now, she was content. She had found her voice, and she would never let it be silenced again. What do you think of Harold McAllister and his chilling actions? From which region are you watching this video? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and rate this story from 0 to 10. How shocking did you find it? Let's discuss.